So thanks everyone, and I hope everyone enjoys.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I am going to take the next 45 minutes to sort of traipse through human history and see how human society has impacted the global environment, and doing this through the lens of the Anthropocene. So I think the first question we should always ask ourselves is, how large is our environmental impact now? And I think this is a really important question because people don't realize how big an impact we have already had. It's because we're individuals and we feel that our little impact is small, but when you multiply that up, it is actually quite huge. So this is because we need to ask the question, are humans a geological superpower? Have we had the same impact on the Earth as a meteorite impact or plate tectonics? Because if so, then we have entered a new geological epoch, which people are referring to as the Anthropocene. So I'm going to use Will Seppen's and Rob Strom's planetary boundaries just as a way of looking at some of the issues. And I love this. So you've got climate change at the top, you've got biogeochemical flows, you've got fresh water, land use, biosphere, ocean acidification, aerosols, ozone. And on the top right, the one I really love is novel entities. This is the idea that we know that we are genetically modifying and we are forcing evolution in places all around the world, but we have no idea what the actual impact will be. So as I said, I'm going to look at the biogeochemical flows. I'm going to focus on nitrogen. I'm going to look at climate change because it's very topical. I'm going to look at land use, and I'm going to look at biosphere integrity. And this is just to give you a flavor of the impact we are having on the planet. So we have a look at this montage of sort of like graphs. Top left, we currently fix half the nitrogen from the atmosphere. Now, the last time the nitrogen cycle was this disrupted was about 2 billion years ago. And this is mainly because we're fixing nitrogen to make fertilizer to feed the world's population. We also, again, top right, massive rise in greenhouse gases, 48% rise in CO2, and 150% rise in methane since the beginning of the actual Holocene. We look at the land surface, 25% of all the land, including Antarctica, is used by humans for settlement, for agriculture, for mining, and other resources. And there's also a distinct possibility that we're entering the 6th mass extinction. Background levels of extinctions are about one species per thousand years. We've already increased that to 100 per 1,000 species per millennium. And the future model is that this could jump again by another 100 or 1,000. Now, as a geologist, I would argue that we're nowhere near 6th mass extinction because, yeah, you need about 10 to 20% of all species to go extinct to be in a mass extinction. We're not there yet. So let's have a look at some other big figures. So we move more soil, rock, and sediment each year than is transported by all the natural processes combined. Damn the geologists. We have made enough concrete to cover the entire world's surface, including the oceans, with a layer 2 millimeters thick. Damn the engineers. We also make over 300 million tons of plastic per year, which can be found in every ocean, including a plastic bag that was found at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, 7 kilometers deep in the Northeast Pacific. The only shame was it did not have Tesco's or Walmart on it. It was just a plain white plastic bag. We also know that we have microplastics everywhere, including in our own bloodstream. Damn the chemists. And this is the shocking stat that really brings home how much we've changed the world. If we take the weight of land mammals now, 30% of that weight are humans. Well, there are 7.9 billion of us. 67% of the weight is livestock and pets. Only 3% are the wild animals that David Attenborough goes out and films, and we sit on the sofa watching with great glee on a Sunday evening. Just 3% of the weight of land mammals are wild. So I would say, welcome to the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, a slice of Earth history during which people have become a major geological force. But the question is then, when did it become? When did it begin? And this is where Simon Lewis and I entered this fractious and vicious debate. And this is a quote from our Nature paper. Because welcome to the great Anthropocene controversy, okay? Because people are not happy whether it should be a epoch, whether it shouldn't be, should it be an event? And the reason being is because of this. This is the geologic timescale. So this is 250 years of work by geologists putting together the actual Earth history into meaningful chunks. This, to geologists, is what the periodic table is to chemists. And as you can see, they are splitting up into the Precambrian on the right, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Within those columns, they're then split into meaningful chunks of time. And that is because what they've done is they found changes in Earth history or the vegetation or the climate, which can then be defined. So we look at the boring end, which is our end, which is the sort of beige. We are in the Cenozoic, we're in the Quaternary period, and we're in the Holocene epoch. And the way these lines are defined, these boundaries, are by GSSPs, or as I call them, golden spikes. And these are particular rock formations, or in the terms of the Holocene ice, where you can actually draw a line and go, this is where the new epoch started. The reason being I put this picture of golden spike is because geologists used to actually drive a golden spike into their type section around the world and were very, very, very upset because they kept disappearing. Who knew? So the Holocene is a bit odd. So we're part of the Pleistocene, which is the last sort of 2.5 million years, but suddenly we have a new epoch that starts 11,650 years ago at the warmest point of the end of the last ice age. And the weird thing is the beginning of the Holocene looks exactly like the beginning of every other interglacial that's happened for the last sort of 2 million years. And so therefore the Holocene definition is a bit odd. It's also in ice, not in sediment, but we'll gloss over that. Also, not only do we have this, but the International Union of Geological Sciences announced not only are we in the Holocene epoch, we're in the Megalanian age, because suddenly the Holocene Working Group has defined 3 ages in the Holocene: the Greenlandian, North Grippian, and the Megalanian. The Megalanian is divided by an event, a drought in the Middle East, India and China about 4.2 thousand years ago, and that they've made as a starting point, even though that's not seen as a global signal. So hang on, I started the whole this saying we're in the Anthropocene. So why are we not in the Anthropocene? Why are we in the Holocene and the Megalanian? Well, this is because of the time wars. There are 2 working groups, the Anthropocene Working Group, the Holocene Working Group, both made up of mainly elderly white male geologists who basically are battling it out to define time. And if you think about it, this is really important because whoever wins gets to define human time itself. So this is a big prize to actually fight over. Okay, so how did we come into this? How does interpreting history through our environmental impact help us look at when perhaps the Anthropocene started. So the first thing is that what Simon and I realized, having done the Nature paper in 2015 and then publishing a book, The Human Planet, in 2018, is we'd accidentally redefined history. And we didn't mean to, it just happened. And we realized that we defined it into 5 different types of human society: hunter-gatherer, agriculturalism, mercantile capitalism, industrial capitalism, and consumer capitalism. And each one of these has a major revolution that precipitated the shift. Domestication, about 11,000 years ago, European expansionism in the 1500s, the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, and then the Great Acceleration in the 1950s. And what's really interesting is this sort of law of history led to us realizing that with each one of these jumps, the population of the planet jumps up markedly, the amount of energy that everybody uses jumps up, and knowledge increases markedly every time. And also, so does the global environmental impact. Now, before anybody jumps onto this and says, well, hang on, there are trends within each. Absolutely. Just because agriculturalism started 11,000 years ago does not mean that new technology was not actually occurring. So during the agricultural revolution, there is money, there is numerics, there is all the other things that have evolved, and there is things. But there are then these big shifts or thresholds. And I'll come back to how we need to get out of consumer capitalism later in the talk. So let's have a look at each one of these stages. So the hunter-gatherers and the mega-fauna extinction. So humans dispersed across the whole world. So evolving 200 to 300,000 years ago in East Africa. Some of them spread out into sort of China about 100,000 years ago. But really, it was about 60,000 years ago that Homo sapien 2.0 spread out and started to have a major impact wherever they went. Slaughtering basically the megafauna wherever they turned up. And we now know that places like Siberia have been greatly affected by the lack of giant herbivores. And so therefore we know that already 50,000 years ago to 11,000 years ago, humans were already altering vast areas just by removing top predators and top sort of like grazers. Okay, but that's really dispersed and doesn't really have a global signature. Perhaps it's the early agriculture and the age of empire. Now, because I work in a geography department and I work with a lot of social scientists, I am very aware that they love to make names for things which aren't necessarily the same as scientists. So this has been called the Plantation-ocene. You know, there's lots of ocenes that are going to happen during this talk. So agriculture developed independently up to 14 different places, okay? And this is really interesting because it's something about Homo sapien 2.0. It is the end of the last ice age. It is the increase in CO2. And suddenly there are plants in the subtropics which are useful that can actually be domesticated. And they spread out. This spreads out slowly over thousands of years and changes the world for good. So this conflict between hunter-gatherers and the agrarian society is ongoing and has been for 13,000 years. We still have hunter-gatherers, but they are on the marginal lands in different continents. As you can see, I've also put up the size of humans. Of course, if you knew that agriculture was going to have such a bad effect on your health, you probably wouldn't have agreed to the revolution. Hunter-gatherers spend about 20 to 30% of their time gathering food. Agrarian societies spend almost all their time farming. So the age of empire. So there is a slow increase of impact. We have the Mongolian, Islamic, the African, the South American and the Central American empires. I'd like to point out that there is no European empire. And this is interesting when we come on to the next stage of development. But this is where Bill Ruderman's radical thought comes in, because he showed that the Holocene isn't like other interglacials. So we look at methane, and the blue dotted line for both methane and CO2 is the average of the last 8 interglacials. So at the end of the ice age, CO2 and methane jump up, gets high, and then it slowly reduces during an interglacial. CO2 gets to a critical threshold of about 240 ppm, and then we slowly go into the next ice age. Except 6,000 years ago, CO2 starts to creep up, and then 5,000 years ago, methane creeps up. Now, it seems now that the evidence is clear that cutting down forest and the spread of agriculture actually changed the CO2 in the atmosphere. And of course, methane was due to cattle and of course, wet rice agriculture spreading out across the whole of East Asia. Now, the interesting thing is we think that that CO2, even though it was a small shift, meant that we got nowhere near the critical threshold of 240 ppm. So early agriculturalists actually prevented us going into the next ice age, which would have been around about now to 1,000 years into the future. So is this when we should start the actual Anthropocene? Well, maybe not. How about globalization of humanity and the Capolocene? So many people have decided this was a really bad event when Christopher Columbus accidentally crashed into the West Indies and called them the West Indies because he actually had no idea where he was. So this meeting of population had a profound effect. So as you can see, this is Benjamin Schmidt's brilliant map showing the shipping logs across across the world. There's no map underneath, it is just shipping logs. And this was the start of the global exchange of species. So the collision of the old and new world. So the first thing was there was a genetic remixing of human population, because the population of the Americas had been isolated for about 13,000 years from the old world. It's also the start of colonization and global slavery, and the irreversible movements of species, crops, animals, and diseases. I'll give you an example. So what did we get from the Americas? Maize, potato, sweet potato, beans, peanuts, squash, pumpkins, tomatoes, chili peppers, avocados, pineapples, cocoa, tobacco, and quinine, a great medicine against malaria. What do we give back? Wheat, sugar, bananas, rice, grapes, dandelions, horses, pigs, cattle, goats, sheep, chickens, smallpox, measles, and typhus. This has been called the Columbian Exchange, which unfortunately is a very mild terminology. We've referred to it as the Great Dying. The reason being is the first contact meant that new diseases were brought to South and Central and North America, and 10% of the world's population died within 100 years. We estimate 56 million people died in the Americas in that 100-year period. Now, this was interesting because it was wave after wave. So firstly, it was measles and typhus, and then as the ships got better, they got quicker across the Atlantic, so therefore they could bring smallpox as well. And with all these people passing away, they were all farmers. So what happened was, of course, all that farmland was abandoned, forest, savanna spread back out, and you can see the CO2 being sucked out of the atmosphere at about 1610. And this is where Simon and I suggested the Orbis hypothesis, world hypothesis, which is perhaps the Anthropocene started in 1610. And again, this would fit with many narratives because 1610, it's the lowest point of CO2 in the last sort of 4,000 years, and actually had some major sociological changes associated with it. Because not only did our exchange of goods change, meeting of two populations, but also our thinking. So in 1492, we were thinking about changing the revolution of the heavens. So suddenly Nicholas Copernicus comes up with the fact that the sun, not the earth, is the center of the universe, and the Renaissance in science, building on all that incredible Arab and Persian knowledge, suddenly explodes and becomes commercialized. And I love this quote. This is a quote for the Holocene. This is René Descartes. And he basically says, in this great city where I am living, with no man apart from myself, not being involved in trade, everyone is so intent on his profit that I could spend my whole life without being seen by anyone. And this was in 1631. Now that sounds like Wall Street in New York. It sounds like the City of London. Actually, it was Amsterdam as the Dutch were building their first great empire. We also have to think of the Holocene, or the age of slavery, because 56 million people died in Central and South America. There was a huge lack of population to be made to work for the Europeans on their plantations. And so what did? They exported humans from West Africa to the Americas to work the plantations. And the interesting thing is, this food production then was shipped back to Europe, which allowed the population of Europe to expand faster and greater than the actual capacity of the land in Europe. And therefore the population of Europe expanded faster than comparable areas such as China. So what about the Industrial Revolution, which everybody thinks is probably the most logical start for the Anthropocene? You know, it obviously happened there, and people have referred to this as the Technocene. Well, this is the great shift to steam and to coal. And what's really interesting is it only happened in one place. It was not inevitable. It isn't like agriculture that occurred in 14 places. It occurred in the Midlands in the 1840s. And there are so many things that we documented in the book that had to be exactly right, that it was exactly right in Britain at that time, including the lack of forests, because we had deforested so much of the land for clearance of land for agriculture, but also to build ships to keep the French out, that we had to shift to coal. And this then spreads like a virus. So within 40 years, it's made it to Russia and Ukraine. It's also made it to Canada, USA, and Japan. But the question is, why Europe? Because when I showed you the age of empires, we had the Mongolian Empire, we had the Islamic Empire, there was no European empire. How did the Europeans suddenly take over the world? And if you think about it, the whole of North America and South America are basically European. And so therefore, what was interesting is looking at it from a geographical point of view. If you think about China, China is a simple landmass. It has a desert to the north, it has mountains to the west, and it has a simplistic coastline. And it is split up by two rivers, the Yangtze and the Yellow, into upper, middle, and lower China. Great. If you then compare that with Europe, about the same size, Europe has a mountain in the middle, radial rivers that split up the landmass into lots of little fragmented bits. You then have this complicated coastline with annoying islands like our own, which basically become fractures. And so what you have is all these principalities and kingdoms that start wars. And so this is our world in data, just looking at when the great powers were at war with each other. From the 1500s to the 1700s, 90% of the time they were at war. And this continual warfare in Europe drove innovation, drove expansionism, and drove technology, to the point in the 1700s, wooden ships could fire a cannonball with pinpoint accuracy over a couple of miles of ocean. Therefore, technology meant they were actually way ahead. So this fragmented wars meant that technology sped Europeans into this rapid expansionism and empire building. But also with this came a change in our thinking again. So we have the emergence of socialism, the idea of the class struggle. And guess what? If you were working in the factories, you were basically getting less nutrition than the farmers, you were getting less sunlight, etc., and your health was poorer. And Marx pointed this out. So, okay, perhaps this should be the start of the Anthropocene. Let's have a look at the Industrial Revolution. This is CO2. Yeah, not much happened. Okay. Now, in the 1900s, when the Industrial Revolution went into its second phase, which was electrification, there's a slight uptick. But the big shift occurs in CO2 and lots of other metrics in the 1950s with the Great Acceleration. So perhaps the Anthropocene started with the Great Acceleration, Neoliberalism, and I love this, the Cthulhu-Ocene, which I'll come back to in a moment. So everything changed in 1944. The Second World War redefined the world, and the Allies got together at a number of meetings, including the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference, to define the new world order. They set up the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, the last two to make sure that countries did not fail economically as they had done between the First and Second World War, because that way collapsed economies, went to basically major wars. And so 44 countries basically agreed that the US dollar would be the backbone of the international exchange, and the gold standard would be $35 an ounce of gold. And it worked. So if you look at energy consumption around the world, from 1950, it has literally gone straight up. Of course, mainly from fossil fuels, whether coal, oil, or natural gas. Population. We doubled the population since 1950. We've more than done that. But we did that by industrializing medicine, by making sure that all preventable diseases were able to be vaccinated against. We also had the Green Revolution in South America and Asia, so we were able to actually produce enough food to feed those extra 3.5 billion people. Massive success story. However, in the 1980s, we had the emergence of neoliberalism. And this was really interesting because I really do believe the economists who are pushing neoliberalism thought it would work. They thought that from the late 1940s until the 1970s, capitalist societies had kept a controlling arm on their business and commerce to make sure that it worked for society. And their idea was, hang on, take the training wheels off. Let basically sort of like the economy do it does best. It would lift everybody out of poverty. And I love this sort of mutual aid cartoon. And to the poor of the world, we say, remember, we're counting on you to keep us rich. In 2017, the International Monetary Fund stated the last generations of economic policies may have been a complete failure, because all that's happened is the rich has got richer and the poor has got poorer, because you need redistribution of wealth if you're actually going to have a system that works. So what is the true state of the modern world? So 7 million children die needlessly each year of preventable diseases and starvation. 825 million go to bed feeling hungry every night. That's up 25 million in the last 5 years. And we all predict with the Ukrainian war, that's going to go up even more. And 1 in 8 people, 1 billion people still does not have access to safe, clean drinking water. So is it a lack of money that is stopping us saving the world? So this is world GDP growth. Admittedly, I plotted it from the 1600s. Yeah, it's an upward curve. So UK GDP in 2021 was $2.7 trillion. So the question is always, why are there poor people? So Oxfam has done this incredible study. So the first thing is to remember the richest 1% of adults rake in 82% of the global wealth. The bottom half, so that's now 3.8 billion people, own about less than 1%. And what they've done is they said, well, hang on, how many of the richest billionaires in the world own the same as the bottom 3.8 billion people? So in 2010, it was 388. By 2015, it was 62. And the last time Oxfam did it, in 2019, just 26 people, less people than are on this webinar actually own the same wealth as the bottom 3.8 billion people. That's when you know that neoliberalism has not worked for the majority. So I mentioned the Cthulhu-ocene. And so this is a brilliant paper by Donna Haraway, a brilliant feminist philosopher. And admittedly, she spells Cthulhu differently, but I am a great fan of H.P. Lovecraft, so I'm going to spell it properly. And it's an interesting paper because she starts to talk about the masculinity of capitalism and how the evilness of the outer reaches of this demand for consumption and rape and pillage of our planet is almost like one of the monstrous non-Euclidean sort of like monsters of late Lovecraft. And so it gives you a real visceral idea of how politics is being played out both in gender and in the environment. So having done all this, why does defining the Anthropocene matter? Why should we worry about what the definition says? I think the reason being is because it tells different stories. So if we define it at the domestication of animals and plants, because it's the stopping of the next ice age, then we're going to blame peasant farmers for our current issues. If it's European expansionism and mercantile capitalism, then it's basically about capitalism, it's about global slavery, it's about the abuse of the environment. Okay. Industrial revolution doesn't seem to have a boundary. The Great Acceleration is all about consumption and consumer capitalism and the Great American Empire. What we do have to do, though, is we have to realize that we need to change the historic relationships. So the interesting thing is, as we go into this post-capitalism, and we can call it anything you like, it's just something beyond consumer capitalism. The first thing to notice is population. Well, population is starting to stabilize. We will get to about just less than 10 billion people by 2050, and that may even shrink slightly. The interesting thing is that is because of women's education up to secondary school level. It's about women's empowerment and wealth generation. And that's really interesting because it means that we are the first species on this planet to self-regulate our population. And it's been due to 1/2 of the population deciding how many children we should have. Energy, again, let's be realistic. Energy, we will need to increase the amount of energy. We have so many people in the world that we need to lift out of energy poverty, we're going to have to generate a lot more energy. Knowledge. Hey, look, with the internet and everything else, the Pandora's box is fully open. We are just going to keep generating more and more knowledge. Whether it's useful and actually can be harnessed is another matter. But the one thing we do have to do is change the environmental impact. So we're controlling the population, but we need a lot more energy. Knowledge will go up, but we need to actually reduce or even reverse our environmental impact on the Earth. So why does the Anthropocene matter? Well, I think it's because science has unfortunately made us feel really inadequate. If you think about Copernicus and Galileo, the idea that we are on a small planet circling a sun. We then got cosmologists going, well, our sun is just one of billions in the Milky Way, and we are just a small dot as a small insignificant sun. And they're basically saying is that our star is one of 10 to 23 stars in the whole galaxy. Yeah, it just makes us feel really small and insignificant. And then, of course, the biologists come along and go, yes, your special place, plants, animals, man, and it was man in the Victorian days, angels, God, you're completely wrong. We're just a slightly smart ape who's lost his tail. Okay, so therefore we're just part of this sort of like narrative. But the Anthropocene says, if this is correct, then humans have become the most powerful impact on the planet. It's impacting the environment and the evolutionary destiny of most of life on Earth. Suddenly, we are the most important thing on the only place we know that life exists in the universe. So instead of being zeros, we are heroes, and therefore we have to realize that we have to become the custodians of this little blue planet and all the life that is contained. So we also have to be very careful because the definition of the Anthropocene is fraught with sociological issues. White geology versus black Anthropocene. And this is where I am taking brilliant work from Catherine Yossef's work at Queen Mary. She pointed out, if you look at the Anthropocene working group, it's all white elderly geologists, male mainly. And what she points out beautifully in her book, Black Anthropocenes, is that every one of the revolutions I talked to you about, the indigenous people, the poorest people, the most vulnerable people in society are always the ones that suffer with that revolution. And therefore, when we're defining the Anthropocene, we have to remember those that have died because of this so-called progress. I also think we need to open up the discussion about good versus a bad Anthropocene. The world is never going to be not affected by humans. So do we want the left-hand picture, which is Paris, green cities, beautiful environment, clean air, or are we going to continue down the path we are at the moment? And there are Charlton Heston suddenly realized he's actually in ancient New York, and basically we burned it all to hell. And so we need to ask whether prosperity and well-being, can we decouple that from environmental damage? And we know we can, it's just have we got the policies to do that? So for me, there are four big challenges of the Anthropocene. And one is climate change, one is environmental degradation, because we are still destroying the environment around us. Remember, we've cut down 3 trillion trees. That's half the trees on the planet. We have to actually deal with global poverty, and we also have to deal with global security, which in the last few weeks is even more starkly shown than it has been over the last few years. And these can only be understood and tackled if we understand our own history and why we have these 4 big issues. So I would like to thank you for listening, and I will happily answer any questions you have. Just to let you know that sort of The work in this talk is In the Human Planet by Simon Lewis and myself. We have each history chapter really documents the changes and also the trends within each one. And we also talk about the politics of the Anthropocene and actually how there are solutions at the end. And because I was frustrated that the book was worthy, I then wrote a very short book, How to Save Our Planet, which is written in the same way as Sun Tzu's Art of War, single sentences, which are incredible bullet points, just fact, 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 which document how we got to this issue. But I also spend 4 chapters showing all the solutions at individual, company, government, and international levels, because I think we spend too much time talking about the issues and the problems and not how to solve it. And I hope this actually has stimulated some ideas of your own.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. And I like the self-plug at the end there.
Of course.
So does anyone have any questions for Mark? Feel free to either put them in the chat or raise your hand and ask out loud. So
Homo sapien
Alex,
2.0.
Yeah.
Okay, so the reason I refer to Homo sapien 2.0 is because there is archaic Homo sapien, which is between 300 and 200,000 years, found in parts of North Africa and East Africa. The true definition of Homo sapien is about 200,000 years in Omo Valley in southern Ethiopia. But that species of Homo sapien that looks fairly like us does spread out, but doesn't do anything. There is something unique about the next second wave comes out about 60,000 years ago. And there's discussion about sort of like there being some self-domestication. Humans seem to be sort of more collaborative. Cumulative culture really takes off then. And suddenly that species, when it goes into an area, not only does it take over from the archaic Homo sapien, it wipes out Homo erectus, it wipes out everything. It just literally takes over. And this is the group which is able to hunt marathon. Okay, they are basically team players, they're working as a collective, and they are just a force of nature that just literally spread out across the world. And so for me, there is something, and the fossils just can't really help us here, because there are some signs of sort of like reduced finger size, reduced facial size, particularly in males, which suggests less testosterone, but these are just hints. But something different happens. That species is radically different from all the ones that have gone before because of the way they operate as a collective and as a team. Lots of questions. There's hands up.
Yes, Walter, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Maslin. That was a really riveting lecture, and I'm definitely going to buy your book. So I was wondering if you can make a few comments on the present conflict that's going on in the Ukraine without putting your political thoughts online, so to speak. Do you think it's a conflict of two groups, two cultural groups trying to meld into one, or do you think it's a war where one group tries to capture the resources of another? In other words, is it culturally driven or is it economically driven?
So it is, I think, politically driven. It is about the idea of how countries and regions perceive themselves and want to relive or reenact their history. The idea that Russia was a superpower and was for sort of like 40 to 50 years the second superpower. They no longer are. Okay, it's very clear. And I think what has failed to be considered, and I think this is a failure of leadership, is that the world is now such a connected place, which is, it is really difficult to have wars like this without major economic consequences. And so there are two major things that are going to happen. One, at the moment, the Russian economy is just being shut down because everybody, because of the connectivity of the global economy, just everybody jump, 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 jump. And that basically will cause huge devastation in the economy of that region for decades. The second thing is, for me, what's really interesting, and this is something I talked on Twitter about, which is suddenly people have gone, energy security. And I've been banging on about this for years, going, well, why do you want Russian gas? Why do you want Qatari oil? Why do you want sort of like Saudi oil? You know, so therefore the movement in governments in Europe to renewables and any other energy source that they control will be accelerated. And so weirdly enough, an awful war may be shifting the global economy to a much more renewable and clean basis than anything the rhetoric or COP26 or any of the negotiations have. So it's an interesting conflict, and it's also clear that people have learned lessons. So if you look at the beginning of the First World War, and people, and I get frustrated because people turn around and go, oh, the First World War was a meaningless war. No, it wasn't. The First World War was about protecting individual states. And it did not matter how small a country was, they had a right to exist. And because what happened with the invasion of Serbia, again, there were lots of connections and agreements. Every country went, okay, I have to agree, I've agreed this, I'm going to support this country. And it was a war against aggression against smaller nations. And so it's really important that that is acknowledged and it isn't a wasted war, even though horrendous outcomes. So there was a real logic for that. In this case, you'll notice the other countries are stepping aside because it could accelerate very quickly into another Third World War, because if we have all these things, that would have actually occurred. It's interesting that, of course, Russia hasn't invaded Poland. Okay, they've invaded Ukraine because they've worked out that there aren't the strong connections there that would cause protection. So there's some really interesting geopolitics in there. That's strayed completely away from my talk. Right. Next question.
Larry, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Mark. That was really stimulating, fascinating. I will also buy a book. But I know this wasn't a publicity tour, and I want to ask a personal question, because I'm aware of your, from my perspective as an archaeologist working in Africa, and I'm in your work as a geologist and a climatologist. When did you come to appreciate that you could bring a voice from that background to one that's relevant to today and tomorrow?
Oh my word. So it's been a slow evolution in my thinking. I mean, the first thing is, and I think this is where people don't necessarily realize that things happen for a reason. So I got very ill in 2001, and it took me a long time to recover. And the weird thing is I couldn't write science. And it sounds really strange. All of you are at the top of your game. You're writing science, you're sort of like, you're writing social science. You have no idea how difficult it is. And when you get knocked down with an illness, that suddenly goes. So I ended up writing a popular book for the Very Short Introduction series by Oxford University Press on global warming. And that allowed me to actually engage with lots of different sort of areas, politics, history, and things like that, to bring that together. And so that was great. and I have to say, my one skill is I'm a synthesizer. So this is why when I've worked with incredible academics on the human evolution stuff, the reason why they have me kicking around is not to drive the cars. It's because I'm really good at trying to put all the bits together and try to actually work out what's actually feeding into what and what's actually controlling that. And I think that's where that idea started. And I have to say, I've been fascinated by human evolution since I was a kid, and so to actually have the opportunity to go to some of these places where it happened is brilliant. And I'm also very, very fortunate that I work with some brilliant people, and I always listen to what they say, because some of the ideas that they come out with are absolutely brilliant. So I'm just a magpie. I sort of like just basically take all their wonderful ideas, put it together, make sure everybody knows that they're their ideas and not mine. But yes, that's really how that's come about. And the whole frustration and the new book, How to Save Our Planet, came about because Simon and I had written this brilliant book, which someone, bless them, basically said, this is Sapiens done properly. It's like, yes. But yeah, it wasn't ever going to sell. It's just like, it was too academic. And there's too many worthy books out there. Books that, I know, sort of like Bill Gates's, Catherine Hayhoe, who I absolutely adore. But these are books that you can just hit people over the head with, And actually, I wanted to write something that was much more for normal people. And one of the things I said is, I wanted a book that I give to the guys that I play football with. They could pick up and read and go, oh, is that what Mark's going on about? So that was really the last straw in my evolution of my thinking, which is how do I actually make it accessible so people can actually go, oh, actually, it's not that difficult to save the planet. It's like, no, it's not.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Larry. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Jonathan?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Jonathan.
Oh, great. I've read both your books and they're brilliant.
Thank you, mate.
I found one fact that was wrong in your latest one, but we won't go into that. What do you...
What was that? Tell me now, quick. What was the fact?
I put it in a tweet. I can't remember what it is now.
Oh, okay.
But it's great. No, what do you think will be the golden spike for the next major transition, the one out of our current, dangerously apocalyptic direction that we're taking? I'm glad you're optimistic, but what do you think, looking back, the scientists will say, that was it. This is the marker. This is when we saw sense.
So I don't think that we're going to leave the Anthropocene. So that's why I really like a definition of the start of the Anthropocene, just because it will help everybody. And I have to say, so the reason being is, if we have a look at some of the modeling of future ice ages, and this is some of the beautiful work, it seems to suggest that even with the current global warming that we've created, even if we stopped everything now, we have probably put off the next ice age for 50,000 years, okay? So the Anthropocene will last 50,000 years. If we continue as we are and we peak higher than we really want to, then we've probably put it off for maybe 100,000, maybe 500,000. And so the interesting thing then is, in geological terms, if we are then 500,000 years into the sort of future, we may actually upgrade the Anthropocene. It's not an epoch. We might actually make it into sort of like an eon, so or a period. And I think that's what I really want to get over with the terminology of the Anthropocene is, this is a period of time that humans decide what happens to the planet, okay? Whether we reforest the whole planet, whether we sort of like suck CO2 out of the planet, it doesn't matter. it's us. And so therefore, even if it's a good period, we do all the positive things, we're still in the Anthropocene because it is our agency that actually will control what the environment. And of course, there are lots of interesting things in evolution that we are doing accidentally. I mean, I love the fact that there's a London Underground mosquito, which can't breed with its the mosquitoes above ground. You know, we didn't do that on purpose. It was just, and so for me, there will be no end to the Anthropocene. I just hope it will go in a particular direction. And the arguments will continue about when the Anthropocene started. So I'm on 2 papers that colleagues of mine argue that perhaps it's an event, not an epoch. You know, yeah. So I just like a nice line in the sand. You know, just define it, move on.
I'm with you on the Orbis event.
Excellent. Nobody else is.
Thank you very much. As I'm going to be 77 this year. I don't think I'm going to live to see the transition, but so nice to know in advance.
Oh, no, Jonathan. Sort of the next. I think the next 10 to 20 years are going to be absolutely amazing. I mean, if you just look at what, say, India wants to do with the amount of renewables, so I think you are going to live through some amazing times. So don't worry about that. You'll see it.
Great. Thank you. I'll hold you to that one.
Mark said, yeah.
Thank you.
That's encouraging. Any more questions before we finished for the day?
Oops.
Anybody else? Have I not annoyed anybody? Have I not shocked historians? I always usually do. Oh, Matt. Oh, come on, Matt.
Hi, Mark. So I'm just trying to get my camera to work. Yeah, I sort of been dragged into this now. I as you probably know, I'm a kind of an Anthropocene skeptic, or was originally before reading some of this stuff. And I just wonder, now that I'm more convinced by the need for this, I wonder if we need to stick to the traditional geological naming terms, or whether, given that this is we're such a powerfully cultural species, whether we might not justify changing the naming terms. So, to give an example, Stephen Jay Gould called us that one peculiar primate that records its own history. And that was obviously a massive, the invention of writing, just as an example, as one mechanism by which we massively increased the ability to transmit and store knowledge, obviously had a fundamental effect on our species. And I'm not postulating yet another Ocene, but would it not be reasonable for us now to say the Anthropocene should be defined in purely cultural terms?
Right. Okay. So, I mean, you're fully aware that I'm working with people like Earl Ellis and archaeologists and sociologists just to try to broaden this debate. So for me, I think there are 2 ways of thinking about it. The first thing is the Anthropocene is a terminology that anybody can use. Okay. All it says is this is where humans become a major geological force. You know. And so therefore you'll find lots of papers refer to the Anthropocene in the generality, and don't worry about when it started. A lot of interesting critiques, which are then saying, well, hang on, is it the Caplocene, Cthulhuocene? I think that's really healthy. On the science side, it is, again, about having a definition. So it's like having the kilogram. Okay, so for me, geologists, I want to basically step up and go, right, we're going to define it, whether it's an epoch or an event, and this is where it starts, this is where it ends. Whether it's right or wrong, doesn't matter. This is it, like the kilogram. We can then have cultural discussions about, well, is weight really weight? You know, does a kilogram really matter? You know, sort of, and then we can actually explore that. But again, science needs definitions, even if we spend most of our time saying that they're wrong. And I think that's where the geologists, had not understand culture. They had not understand their role in society. And this is one of the fascinating things about academia, because geologists, even though they are the ones mining the metals, digging up the oil, digging up the coal, etc., they have no engagement with society. So when the Anthropocene debate came along, they just thought they were just going to sit down in a little committee and just basically argue about it. And they were absolutely amazed when historians, sociologists, geographers, archaeologists went, no, you're wrong. And that they'd had no mechanism to deal with it. So this is why it's a mess. But for me, I think the most important thing is just the terminology of the Anthropocene says the environmental impact of humans on the planet is more than climate change. And I think that's something that I've been really aware of, is that the climate change narrative has dominated the last 30 years of our debate. We have forgotten about plastics. We have forgotten about pollution. We have forgotten about the sort of like aerosols. We've forgotten about all the deforestation and biodiversity. So somehow we need to bring that all back into a terminology that says we've got to actually put all of this together. It's not just about whether the temperatures are going to get warmer or not. It's about, do we actually reforest the whole of North America? You know, does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So we can go ahead and end it there, seeing as it's 2:03. So thank you, Mark. That was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I think everyone else did as well. So thanks everyone for coming. I hope that you'll all join us next week. We're having a talk from Emmanuel Nadima, who's going to be talking about some Middle Stone Age sites in Kenya. So yeah, I hope to see you all then. So yeah, bye for now. Thanks, Mark, for coming.
Thank you for inviting me. Take care, guys. Have a great day.